If you look at a P&L or profit and loss for the podcast, you would say, Whitney, you are insane. Why in the world are you doing this and this kind of expense and this kind of time commitment? But if you looked at our business at the same time, I mean, it's an obvious progression. It's our network was growing so fast because of me doing a daily podcast. There's so many lessons learned. There's so many mentors that I've met through the podcast. It's obvious that it's been worth it as far as our business. This is your daily real estate syndication show. I'm your host, Whitney Sewell. We have a little different show for you today. This hasn't happened too many times, but believe it or not, I'm being interviewed instead of me interviewing someone else. Well, years ago when we started the podcast, I built a team, right, to produce the show, doing so many shows. I knew that was probably going to be the most efficient way to do it. And believe it or not, today we have the man that's now behind that team, leading that team and doing lots of other marketing stuff for lots of other clients now as well. His name is Brian Pickrell. Brian, welcome to being the host of the show today.
Yeah, thank you, Whitney. It's great to be here. Today, we have the opportunity to flip the mic and interview Whitney Sewell, the host of the Real Estate Syndication Show. He's been doing this for several years, and he is a pro. He's been interviewing guests and has developed a lot of skills and learning and listening. And we sort of want to ask him what got him into podcasting, some tips and tricks and things of how we can learn how to be better producers in podcasting, or maybe even thinking about why should I even start a podcast. So Whitney, you've been a great listener and have hosted a lot of guests. We really want to hear from you and your experience. Over 1,700 shows now. That's an incredible amount of podcasts. And so we want to really sort of get into what you have learned and your experience. So I can remember sort of as you beginning this journey with LifeBridge, one of the first things you did in this sort of business and branding was start a podcast. So when I'm thinking about starting a business, if I'm thinking of podcast, I'm thinking, let me get some things under my belt. Let me get some things rolling. And then I think about a podcast, but you started right out of the gate doing a podcast. So what got you to that place that said, I want to start a podcast?
Early on, Brian, I'd never imagined starting a podcast. I didn't even know what a podcast was. I don't think. I definitely, wasn't listening to any at the time, and had probably, now that I'm thinking back about that, the timing there, I may not have even had a smartphone yet.
That's great.
Isn't that silly? But much less, listening to podcasts, right? And so when I knew that commercial real estate was something I wanted to pursue, and being self-employed and business and all those things, I one of the first things I did was look for a mentor. And ultimately, in looking at different mentors, once I selected who that should be and started diving in there a little bit, one of the big things that caused him to grow so fast and to have success quickly was he started a podcast, and so, and to me, it was almost that simple. It was like, okay, if it works for him, and and I could tell it had worked for so many. It wasn't just him. The more I started learning about it, I was like, okay, if that can work like that, it can work for me as well. Let's just go make it happen. And he also had a daily podcast, and so I thought, okay, let's just do a daily podcast and figure out how to make it happen. And, even through that, and I know we're going to talk about that some, but, I would highlight that early on, even before I launched the show, I was traveling to lots of conferences at the time, talking to lots of people, and so many, obviously, who had started podcasts. They all talked about how hard it was, how difficult it was to get all the show notes done and all the shows posted, or finding guests and getting the editing done. And they all talked about the difficulties of getting it all accomplished, or they get behind. And the one thing they had in common was that they all had a weekly show. And so it made me question, like, am I crazy? Right? For trying to do 7 days a week. And I even met with a couple people specifically. I'll never forget that I trusted, and looked up to in a big way, told them about what I was thinking about doing. And these two people were like, Whitney, don't do that. That's crazy. Don't do that. And so this is where a mentor really comes in handy too. So I talked to him about it, and he's like, that's why you have to do it. That's why, because it's too much work for most people, right?
Yeah.
And that's why you have to do it. And so yes, early on, I had I don't know that I'd spoken into a microphone more than a half dozen times in my life, and then, but at this point, it was almost that simple. Hey, if it worked for him, worked for this many people, it can work for me as well. Let's figure out how to make it happen.
Wow. So your ambition was you just want to do this right, but as you're looking at someone that's sort of already done it and you just said, let's go for it. Now, what was your experience? You said you hadn't really ever talked into a microphone, but what was your experience as far as speaking or getting in front of a crowd and talking and communicating as far as that goes?
This should be very helpful for many that are listening who are thinking about starting a podcast but are fearful. I had none, no experience, no experience speaking in front of people or into a microphone in any way whatsoever. And if you listen to some of the first shows, and I think it took me a lot longer than most, but you're going to hear how horrible it was. But I would say, hey, your first 20 shows are not going to be as good as your 100th show, right? And are not going to be near as good as your 200th show, but you're not going to get to 200 unless you start with the first one.
Right. Yeah. So I love that you just weren't really afraid of that. And I think sometimes that keeps us from even trying something because we're afraid of this is going to be really stupid. It's going to be cringy. It's going to be hard for me to watch
Care
and
about
look
what others
back on.
think too much, right?
Yeah. That's so true. And I think if you want to learn something, you have to just sort of dive in, learn as you go. And that's one of those things about the podcast is that you sort of learn it on stage, you know. So talk about a little bit how you went from, all right, I'm just going to start it and you're doing a daily podcast. So what has been the most rewarding as you're thinking about over 1700 shows? What's been one of the most rewarding things of doing this show? Has it been worth it? I mean, is it worth doing this daily podcast? Is it worth doing a podcast at all in your viewpoint?
Yeah. No, great question. I've had that question hundreds of times, especially doing a daily podcast. Everybody wants to know, is it worth it? Is it worth it doing a daily podcast? Because they just can't imagine the workload required to make that happen, much less the expense as well to make that happen. It's definitely not cheap to create something like that and to do that many interviews. But it's obvious that it's been worth it as far as our business. And if you looked at, and what I usually tell people, if you look at a P&L or profit and loss for the podcast, you would say, Whitney, you are insane. Why in the world are you doing this and this kind of expense and this kind of time commitment? But if you looked at our business at the same time, you would, it's an obvious progression. It's our network was growing so fast because of me doing a daily podcast. There's so many lessons learned. There's so many mentors that I've met through the podcast. So I used to record, say, 12 to 15 interviews in one day, and we can talk about how we did that, but and still do that to some degree, not hardly that many. But if we have an issue in the business, there's a good chance it's going to come up a few times, right? While we're doing interviews, especially early on, right? I'm interviewing all of these experts and I'm going to somehow bring up something we're dealing with, right? To learn how these people have done it. And I just can't even put a value on that, right? Having access to that kind of those people, that many people that were at the time, and many that still are way ahead of me and LifeBridge Capital at the time, where I can say, well, what about this? And not ultimately saying it's something we're dealing with at the moment,
Yeah.
right? Or this kind of issue, but there's so much value in that. But much less how fast our network grew, right? So all of a sudden, our email list or just whatever it just grew in ways that I never imagined. But the first year of the podcast, when I was still traveling to conferences as hard as I could go, first few years of the podcast, and the first year at conferences, nobody knew who I was, right? The next year, most people knew who I was. And then by the third year, I'm speaking at the conferences. And so, you can imagine that progression. I never imagined speaking into a microphone ever, much less, being, say, a keynote speaker or one of the first speakers at some really large conferences in front of thousands of people at a time. Never imagined that. Never envisioned myself being any kind of speaker. Still don't really. But it's pushed me to improve. It's pushed me to get out of my comfort zone in ways that I never imagined.
Yeah, so you've scaled the business and LifeBridge Capital. It's given you an opportunity really to reap the benefits of putting in the effort, putting in the energy, doing hard things, doing uncomfortable things, but has given you that sort of trustworthy because, and I think this goes for any business, but when I think about real estate investment, people are putting a lot of money on the line and they got to be able to trust the people behind that is, taking on that investment. And I think it's really speaks to people getting to know you, people they're recognizing you at these conferences, in part because they're hearing you every day or have the opportunity to hear you through this podcast. So it's helped your business. So what else would you say as far as personal development or personal growth, just doing a podcast? How has this helped you as an individual, as a professional leader, just to grow some of these skills that it takes in doing a podcast?
I think I'm challenged all the time by people that I'm interviewing, right?
Mm,
That's one way. I interview them, I ask them questions, and even from obviously, processes in their business or how they're successful, whatnot, but even to daily habits and things. So I learn like just things that they do to be successful, whether it's, in their business or even at home, right? That I can start to implement right away, and over many years now. It's pushed me to feel more comfortable, obviously, in front of a camera, speaking into a microphone. That just drives so many people crazy. And I think at first I was just as nervous as anyone, right? The first day that I recorded any podcast, I recorded 3 shows. The very next day, I recorded 5. The very next day after that, I recorded 8. And so when I say like, we jumped right in, we literally jumped right in and just started recording lots of shows. And so, I recorded more in 3 days than a lot of people will record in weeks and weeks and weeks, right? And even in months sometimes. And so I knew that it was like just throw me into the fire type thing, right? And I knew that was the way I was going to get better. But they were horrible. They were horrible, right? But it was the only way to, like I said earlier, get past say that 20th show or that 50th show, and but we did that fast, right? And even within the first say month and a half to 2 months, I'd probably recorded 60 to 80 shows. I can't remember exactly.
wow.
But it was fast because I knew I wanted to launch with like 60 shows recorded before we ever launched. We wanted that many ready. And we did. We had, I think, 60 or 70 shows recorded and ready to go out before we ever launched the podcast. And so it pushed me to think about scaling. It pushed me to, and so one way too, if I had done a weekly show, Brian, I think that I would have tried to have done all the editing myself. I would have tried to have saved every penny. I would have said, you know what, I can figure it out. And that's just my mentality about lots of things. Hey, I'll figure it out. I may not know right now. But in this case, I'm glad I didn't even try to figure it out. But I would have if I'd done a weekly podcast. But by doing 7 times as much as most people, I knew that wasn't possible. It wasn't even an option for me to do all the editing and all that stuff. So it pushed me in a different direction, right? And that was to hire people and to build a team. And so that was something I'd never done before, right? And so it made me think through processes and hiring people and communicating with the team and all those things from the very beginning that I had never even thought about doing before, which wouldn't have happened if I had done, say, a weekly show, right? It just changed the way I had to think about it. It changed the way I had to think about scaling and at a whole new level than I had ever thought about before.
Mm. There's lots of things in there, Whitney. You said we could jump off on several of them. One of them that kind of stands out to me is so you're doing before you really ever launch the podcast, you got 60 podcasts under your belt. So you're not coming up with all of this content. You're bringing on guests. How are you getting that many guests? How are you coming up with the content for this? That just seems like such an impossible task.
Yeah. Finding guests are difficult. I mean, especially 30 a month, right? It's very, very difficult. And even the others, people that I would talk to that's doing a weekly show would say it's so difficult to find guests. And I would say it almost doesn't get easier. I mean, once you build a big enough following, there's more people that want to be on your show. So it's a little easier, but there's still so much work that's involved in guest sourcing. And doing this many, it's difficult to find that many good guests, right? I'd be lying if I said they're all amazing because they're not. That's for sure. But doing a weekly show, I think would be easier because you could be so much more selective. That is one downside to doing a daily show. But as far as guest sourcing, I had to find somebody from the very beginning to help with that, right? I think the first few months, I remember we knew we had to send almost 300 invitations to get 30 guests. And so
Wow.
you think about that, right? And so I hired a guy, he was in another country and I built out a process see, even that, like I wouldn't have thought this way if I was doing all of it. So I knew that, hey, I got to build out a process for this guy. And, it was going to other podcasts that I laid out for him, this show, or these other websites. And you look up, their website to figure out, how to connect with this person, build out templates for this guy to send to these potential guests. Hey, we'd like for you to be on the show. Tells them a little bit about the show. We had to automate this process to ways that I never would have thought about before, right? Obviously putting in scheduling links so they can schedule it and automatically sends them a Zoom link and, notifies them when the show's coming up, and even creating a video and making this as short as possible. I think it's a 2-minute video that tells a guest what I need them to know before we ever get on, right? And I need them to have their mic ready. I need them to, know these things because I don't have time to go over those things beforehand more times than not now, especially doing this many shows back to back to back. And so, when I would do say 12 or 15 interviews, I may have 5 to 10 minutes from ending one recording before I'm starting another one. And typically I'm still on the Zoom call with those people during that time, right? And oftentimes the time after the show, I want to mention this just so listeners know, the time after the show often was the most valuable. So we get done recording and then it's kind of, right. A little more relaxed conversation. And that's when the guests might even share a little bit more about what we were talking about. Or I often take notes to where I may take notes about things that I want to ask that guest about, but it's something that I knew I shouldn't ask them during the show, and
Right.
so even that was some educational time with those people that I didn't expect. But what I was saying, if I'm doing 12 to 15 interviews, those people had to be ready, right? I needed them to be ready. If we have to spend 15 minutes on their mic, I've got to say, hey, I'm sorry. We can't do the recording, right? We'll have to reschedule you. And so I needed them to be prepared. But all that process had to be thought out and had to happen, from the person guest sourcing as well, right? They kind of start that process. And they would have to, I'd have to give them some guidance of how to look at the bio or think about what this person's done in real estate or how can this person add value to our listeners. It may be somebody that's never done anything in real estate, but they're really good at marketing in some way, or they're really good at, some other skill set that myself or our team needs, right? And so, but guest sourcing even today is still very difficult, right? To find that many, but then now it's, finding that space in my calendar to record that many shows. Obviously, that's changed a little bit now compared to the way I was doing it then because I was still working full time then. So I was working, I was off work every other Monday when I was a federal agent. And that Monday, our team knew that they better have at least 12 to 15 interviews scheduled. That's the only way we could keep up. And so that's what pushed us to, me to record that many in one day. And you already think, well, Whitney, how could you create good content? I would say, what? I would also say, it wasn't all amazing content by any means, but you're going to learn a lot by interviewing that many people, and the guests or the listeners are going to learn a lot too by listening to that many people, right? And so, or how do you come up with that much content? Well, it's learning to ask good questions. It's learning to listen well, like you've talked about, Brian. And I think that is a learned skill. And I definitely have gotten better at that, listening to the guests and following up with good questions that I think the listeners, are probably thinking as well. And it also comes down to taking good notes while you're interviewing. I didn't do that early on because I thought, well, I was so nervous, right, about interviewing, so nervous about trying to talk to this person and making eye contact, looking at the camera, all those things that, that can, the technical things that really distract you from the conversation early on. Right. And you get lost in those things because you're not used to holding your head just right to speak into a microphone, when you're moving your head around, and making sure you're not too close or too far away. And then all of a sudden you've forgotten what the person just said. Yeah. Right. You have no clue what the guest said. Right. And now you're having to just come up with something or random, and I've had to do that probably thousands of times now, but taking notes was a game changer for me once I thought, what, I've got to start taking notes. And because somebody might talk for 5 minutes, then all of a sudden I forgot what they said the first 2 minutes,
Right. Yeah, no, that's incredible. I'm thinking as you're beginning this process, and I'm really thinking about that person that's thinking about starting a podcast, or maybe they've started and it's just not taken off. First of all, you kind of answered my question of how do you find the time? Because I'm thinking, did he quit his job? I couldn't remember what it was. Did he just start producing podcasts? He's hiring a team. How is he funding this? But you were working full time, and then just scheduling all of these shows in one day, and just, I'm sure you were just locking yourself in a room and getting it done.
Literally, Chelsea, my wife would pack me lunch to go to the basement. I mean, it was, and I wouldn't get to eat most of the time. I mean, it was just madness. I mean, she would see, oh yeah, she would call it my marathon day, because it literally was as hard as I could go for 15 interviews, just nonstop. It was just, and I would even recommend it honestly to most people because so people ask me still, like, Whitney, is it worth it? One of my first questions to them is, are you married? Do you have kids? I mean, seriously, because it is a commitment to the whole family. It's not just for you, right. It is insane. And it may not be worth it on that front, right? If it disrupts the home, I would almost say it's not worth it at all, right? But or to even think about doing a daily show. I think I had no idea early on the level of commitment it was going to take from me, period, much less the entire family, right? Yeah. From my wife, and because it was like I was in the house, but I was the absent father and husband, as horrible as that is to admit, it's the truth.
Yeah. So when I think about times like that, Whitney, you have to view them, I think, as sort of a season.
Yeah.
And you mentioned a marathon. A marathon runner does not train intensely running a full marathon every day of the year. It's not sustainable. And I think if we recognize those points in our life for I'm going to just have to buckle down for this season of my life and just do some intense training, knowing I can't do this forever. I can't sustain this. And then once I get to that point, I'm sure once you got to the point where you were able to go full time in real estate syndication and those type of things, that sort of made it all worth it. But I think recognizing that here's a short season, I'm just going to have to grind, knowing I can't keep this up. So let's go look a little bit back to beginning this podcast. Did you just go out and buy? I mean, what did you start with as far as equipment? What are you using now? Do you have recommendations? Do you have to have everything that you have now? What would be your recommendation to podcast people that are thinking about starting a podcast, and people maybe that are already doing one?
Yeah, you can't let having to have good equipment keep you from getting started, right? You can't. And most of us could have a phone that's able to be an amazing podcasting piece of equipment, right? Video and audio. And you can even get a lapel mic that can connect to your phone, and all of a sudden you have a better podcast studio in your pocket than most people ever thought about having 5 years ago. Right. I
Right.
mean, even with other equipment, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, it's just amazing how good it is. You and I were just talking about your phone and how the videos or the cameras like tracking you around. It's amazing tracking you around as you move. Like, what kind of camera do you have? Oh, it's my phone. Like, what? It's crazy, you know? But so all that to say, most people have the top notch phone in their pocket, right? And it's so highly advanced as far as audio and video, and even going live, and uploading all those things. But I started with a mic. It's called an ATR Audio Technica, a 2100, and you can get it on Amazon for like $80, right? And I think I recorded, probably 1,400, interviews with that. And I was probably interviewed, 200 or 300 times on other people's shows with that same mic. And it done just fine. And actually, I still have it. I actually have two of those now, and I take those with me when I'm traveling. If I'm going to do an in-person interview, or if there are times, especially doing that many, I'm traveling, I may do interviews in the hotel room. I try not to do that now, but when I was still working full time and traveling, I didn't have a choice. I would have to do those interviews even if I'm in the hotel room, and that mic has been great for that. I have a Logitech, a $50 Logitech camera. And believe it or not, it's what I'm still recording on right now. I have recently purchased a better camera, but I don't have it set up yet. And so I've recently tried to improve some equipment, but it just doesn't have to be amazing equipment to be good enough for podcasting. One thing I've learned is, too, is podcasting, especially through a mic. And Brian, you're going to know a lot more about this than I do. But the USB port's typically the weakest link for me, or like the Audio Technica is a USB mic, and so you can just plug and play and record, and it's very simple, right? You don't have to have a bunch of equipment, and so often for podcasts, it's better than it has to be, right, for most people to listen. But I did upgrade to this Shure SM7B microphone
Yeah.
a while back, but it's just not necessary. I think it's more for cosmetic purposes than anything, right?
Yeah.
It does build a little credibility. I think when people see it, those things. But that's really the biggest reason, just to be honest. I mean, it's not. I don't think it's necessary, right, to have a mic, this nice, like I'm speaking into now. But I have one set up at my house. It's just an ATR 2100, like I was talking about. And I have one that I take with me when I'm traveling. I also have some small, the cordless mics, that I can hook up as well. But all of that came much later, right? Much more recent, actually. But yeah, early on, an ATR 2100 $80 mic is going to be all I think anybody needs just to get started. You're going to learn so much in your first, say, 50 episodes, and unfortunately, most people don't make it past show 20,
Mm.
and so you get past that with that mic, you have some success, you start, you're measuring your downloads, you're having growth. Think about upgrading later down the road, right? The most important thing is that you get started. And also, it doesn't even have to be video early on. We did start video from the very beginning. My thought was, I've already got you here. Why not go ahead and do video and create the video content at the same time? But you don't have to, right? It could just be audio. It would make it much more simple and much cheaper. And I think you're probably going to have almost the same amount of benefit, probably if it was just audio, unless you're really big on YouTube, or like other platforms, video wise. There's going to be just other marketing you can do, right, with shorts and all that stuff now. But even that's more recent stuff, right? 5 years ago, that wasn't as big of a thing, as it is today.
Yeah, it's a question I get a lot is people that are sort of deciding and starting a podcast, should we even fool with doing a video? Can we just start with an audio? And I think if it's so intimidating that starting in video and being on camera, I think maybe just start, like you said, just start with audio, get comfortable speaking, get comfortable with the content, understanding what you're doing, and get that sort of under your belt, and then begin maybe to add video. There are a lot of pros to adding video, like you said, because you can create other content. You've got long form content in a video. You can cut that down into shorts and reels. And one of the leading platforms for podcasts is actually YouTube. So it's one of the most watched ways people watch, and they actually just recently added the category for podcast that now it takes the video, converts it into audio, because they're kind of wanting to compete with Spotify and Apple Music or Apple Podcast, and they'll take those videos and convert them into audio for you, so that when you're watching the video and you get in the car, it automatically picks up in YouTube Music. And so there are some benefits to doing video. So think a little bit, Whitney, about, you knew who your audience was, and I think that was really important to the success of the podcast. Can you speak just a little bit to about the work you did before you ever pushed record? What was the work that you did before, or maybe even the thought you had of, I'm going to start a podcast and here's what it's going to be about? How important is that, getting that right before you hit record?
It's similar to the equipment in some ways. It's like, man, it can't hold you up. You can't wait forever till it's perfect, right? Till you think it's perfect. However, I do think it's very important that you have thought through the name and the branding, but even more so who your listener is. Like, you need to know a lot about just that avatar, right? Who is this person? When are they listening? And really even write it out. Like, just imagine somebody that you're trying to reach and write out who this person is and think through when they're listening, how long they have, whether it's on the way to work, is it in the gym, how old are they, what do they do for work, all those things that you need to know about that person, because that's going to help tailor your content in a massive way, right? Even thinking through video. Well, are they listening? Are they watching? And probably more people are watching on YouTube now than ever before, right? I watch more, and it's even in one comment there, it's even used more, I think, for a search engine now than ever before as well. So people find me because they're searching somebody that's been on the show, and I pop up, right? And so anyway, YouTube's so valuable that way. But thinking about, what's the industry that you're in, and you're going to think through that when you're thinking about who's listening, but really niching down. And there a big hold up here is that people think that, they have to just blow this podcast up. They have to have hundreds of thousands of listeners to be successful, or it's just a flop. And I would say that is very far from the truth. You can have 1,000 true fans, and you can do so much with 1,000 or even 500 true fans. In our business, you can raise a lot of money from 500 followers that think you're amazing, right? And they want to invest with you. That's life changing, to be honest, just that many, right? So it doesn't have to be this, like, top of Apple or iTunes or whatever, podcast right off the bat to be successful. But you do want to try to niche down. And I'll give you an example of that. And so, like, we could be, in real estate, do you want to focus on, let's say, commercial real estate? Well, the commercial real estate podcast, well, that's pretty broad, right? But then we could say, well, we're going to be the multifamily podcast, right? Well, that's commercial real estate, but now it's focused just on that one asset class, right? Well, you could niche down even more and more, and think through, just really diving in. You could even niche down, say, to the acquisition process of multifamily real estate, right? So we could really niche down, or we could say, okay, the lending process in multifamily real estate, right? If I was a lender, well, I know exactly what that show is going to be about, and that's going to be a very tight audience, right? That's going to want to hear just about the lending process in multifamily real estate, right? However, you're going to get to, say, that 500 true fans much faster, right? That way, because you are very niche down. Otherwise, you're going to kind of have an inflated number of downloads, right? And then people are going to figure out, it's not really what I was looking for, and it's going to come back down, right? And it may fluctuate because of that, as opposed to just really niching down, people knowing exactly what they're coming for, right? Who you are and what they're listening to from the very beginning. And I would say I probably could have done that. I probably could have niched down again. I could have niched down, say, the multifamily, daily real estate syndication show, whatever. However, I didn't do that because of doing a daily show. And I knew that I had to keep it more broad to more asset classes in commercial real estate. And so I would say there are ways that you could probably be more successful by niching down even more. But in my case, I felt like I had to leave it a little bit more broad because of doing a daily show. On the name though, the daily real estate syndication show, right? When we started the podcast, I had never syndicated a deal before. Okay.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so I had a friend of mine, he was doing a bunch of conferences. I had started the podcast and, the podcast started taking off and I was standing up on stage speaking with him. And I didn't intend for him to say this to everybody, but he did. But he said, this guy who's talking about the podcast, he said, and he's never even syndicated a deal before, but started the real estate. I'm like, I don't want them to know that, but he shared that with everybody. But it turned out to be, it was just fine. But it was just a push to, hey, you have no excuse to
Yeah.
not starting a podcast about this topic. I didn't have to be an expert in the beginning. It allowed me to become more of an expert by interviewing and speaking, right, to all these people. But I had to know that up front. Hey, this is going to be the name of the show. This is going to be the focus, right? This is who the avatar is. I have to be very committed to a daily show. I knew I had to have, I hope to have at least 45 to 60 days of shows up front before we launch because I'm going to have issues, right? There's going to be issues in communication with the team, or I might need to go, travel for work for a week or 2 weeks. And then, and the show would have to stop and all those things that are thought out through early on. But I would encourage you to, there's so many YouTube videos now about how to start a podcast, the equipment needed, all these steps, right? It's not rocket science now, but I would tell you, put a date to it, right? Put a date by this day, I'm going to launch, and then reverse engineer. Here's the things that need to happen to make to get that done. Brian and I have mentioned a number of them. Even today, there's a number more things that we could talk about that, as far as launching and whatnot, but put a date to it and even be public about the date, right? So you're held accountable, not just, by the date you wrote down in your journal, but even by your family. Yeah, even post it on social media. If you're really committed, post it on social media so others are holding you accountable as well.
Yeah. So you mentioned where things are at now. You can find a lot about how to start a podcast. And part of that is because I think people are beginning to catch on. Hey, this is very beneficial for my brand. This is important for people to understand. So speaking to that, because you've got a show, several of your guests have their own shows. Is it oversaturated? Do you see it still being beneficial for someone to start a podcast, even in real estate syndication?
That's a great question. That's still something everybody says, oh, there's so many podcasts. And it's just an excuse, I think. So I don't have to start a podcast, right? But you have to think about your following, Brian's going to be much different than my following. Even if we're talking about the same thing, there's going to be people that are attracted to, to you that aren't attracted to me, right? They don't like my personality, but they love yours, and vice versa. Again, it's the 500, say 1,000 true fans that you need to be after, not the 100,000. That may happen, and that would be amazing, or strive towards that, right? That kind of quality of content and valuable content, that would be great. But you and I could do the exact same show, even the same name, which I wouldn't recommend. But even if we did, we're going to have very different fan bases, right? Or followers, or people that are, coming to the show to learn because they're going to like you better than me or me better than you for whatever random reason, and so I think it's so irrelevant. People use that excuse all the time to not start a podcast,
Right.
or there's so many. Well, yes, and it's probably not going to get smaller, right? And so the longer you wait, the further behind you're going to be. And so, yeah, you're going to have your own following that's going to be different than this person or that person or that person, that's talking about some of the same stuff.
Yeah. And so I think that would be important to also establish, if you're going to start this, don't do what Whitney does. Don't do what other people do. Be who you are. Take some of the things that they've done and built and strategies and processes, but let your personality come through on that. So Whitney, let me wrap up just a little bit. So as you're thinking about over the past 1,700 podcasts, if you were to start a podcast today, what would you do different?
When I've answered that in the past, I've said start 2 shows a day.
Wow.
However, knowing how much work it is, I'm not sure it's like possible or but it is. I think it has been that worth it.
Mhm.
And to do a daily show. However, I would say that just as an entrepreneur and as say a business owner, as your business grows, like what you are focused on changes and it has to change, right? As you have a team of people now versus just say you and one other person doing everything, right?
Right.
It just changes. And so I think like I think it's still worth us doing a daily show. But I don't know now that it's as valuable, say, for me to do me to be the one doing it every day, right? And
Mm.
so I still do most of the shows now, but I may have another team member or host a number of shows, or my business partner Sam, he may host some shows.
Right.
I may invite somebody else to co-host for a period of time that's just a good friend of mine in the business, right? They can add a ton of value in this space as well, but it keeps me from having to spend so much time right recording, but still adding just as much value to the listeners at the same time. But so if I had to do it again, I would still do a daily show. I think I would have a better expectation of the time commitment. I would have spent more time thinking through maybe um, who the guests are,
Mm.
and doing a better job probably at guest selection, even though it's very difficult, right, to do this many. I would say you can focus too much on that as well, and really the one way that we've been successful in it is just producing a ton of content. Even though I know it's not all amazing, right? And we've done the best we can, and we're trying to continually improve. But I also think early on, I could have done a better job just on the marketing front as well. I personally have no experience in marketing or expertise, and I couldn't afford it at the time. But I think early on, if I had just spent a month with a marketing team of some kind, or seeked a little more education about marketing the podcast, we would have gone a lot further, a lot faster, especially the launch process. I did not, I didn't even think about there being a process to launching a podcast for it to be more successful, and didn't put enough weight on how important that is, on how that is done. And I know more about that now, but I still don't know enough now about it. And obviously, it doesn't apply to me as much now. But if I was launching a new show, I would be much more strategic about how it's launched, even how the network knows that it's going to be launched. I mean, just like all those things, instructing them on what to do and helping me to be successful from the very beginning.
Yeah. Well, that's really helpful, Winnie. Thank you so much for walking us through your journey, and knowing that I'm sure you have many more shows worth just to walk us through some tips and tricks. And hopefully we can do this again as we think about all the networking opportunities it's given you, the platforms, and giving you a voice, cross collaboration and things like that too. I'm sure that has been very helpful and beneficial, and even just the practical things I think are really helpful, just to kind of think through a little bit about what that means. But I love the thought of being able to get in there and just say, just go for it. I mean, what's stopping you from doing that? And especially, I think we all have a voice, and it gives us an opportunity really just to kind of think through, to learn, to bring on guests that are experts in their fields, and to really learn from them. And sometimes, like you said, you're going to have some bad guests, and that's kind of like, view it as watermelon. You just, you swallow the good stuff, spit out the seeds, and go on to the next guest, and learn from it. But I think we can all learn from the discipline, I think, of what it takes to be committed to something like a podcast on a consistent basis. And I think the consistency has really helped you. That's sort of giving you those dates, go ahead and putting that out there, having that commitment, putting the work in the front end has really kept it going. A lot of projects I've started and didn't have a date, didn't have a plan, and didn't execute some of those things early on, and it just kind of fizzled out. And it was sort of I don't know if it was a phase or a trend, and it just didn't stay with you. But so I really am super impressed that you have done this many shows, and has stayed with it, and have learned a lot. But you've committed to a lot of people. and being able behind the scenes a little bit, Whitney, I get to see some of those conversations and how the guests are just very grateful to be on your show. And I think that really goes back to that you're just really having a conversation with people, right? And you're just getting to know this person, and you just happen to be recording it. And I think that's the cool thing about a podcast, is because you just kind of get to sit, pull up a chair, and have a conversation with experts in their field, which is hard to do. I mean, it's just to be able to do that. And you're giving people that opportunity really every day.
Can I
And
speak to
so,
that just a moment?
yeah,
I
absolutely.
thought about, we didn't mention it a minute ago, but I thought I get this question all the time as well. It's just as far as producing this many shows, obviously I can't like do a ton of prep work on all these guests, right? And
Mm,
even that is part of the process for the team. And so somebody is writing intros for me, right? And so, even when I was doing 12 or 15 a day, I would open up one Google Doc and it would have every interview that day listed out, right? And it's going to have the guest name, it's going to have the show number that they're going to be, the date that it's going to be launched, like all that's part of the process, right? So we already know that. And so it's put on there. So immediately right then, I can say, hey, if I'm interviewing Brian, I can say, oh, Brian, Brian, this is going to be show number WS 1723, whatever it is. And it's going to come out on this day, right? I'm telling them right then. And so a lot of guests are even writing that down,
yeah.
right? And so that's the first chance that I'm letting them know when it's come out. So hopefully they share it, right? When it comes out, right? Hopefully they're letting their team know. But most of them are even impressed that I can even do that. I mean,
Yeah.
they're like, "What? You already know when it's coming out?" I'm like, "Sure, I do." It's like it's not rocket science here, And so, but some guests are nervous as well, right? And so it is what you just said. You tell them, "Hey, this is just a conversation. It's just like you and I meeting at a conference." And I trail them. My goal is not to trip you up, right? My goal is
Yeah.
to focus on what you're really good at. And so I ask every guest before an interview. Here's a tip that I learned the hard way, and it wasn't very fun, by the way. But I learned the hard way by being on somebody else's show that didn't prepare me or themselves
Mm,
whatsoever, and it was not a great experience. And it didn't do them, their listeners, or me any favors. It only harmed, probably, if anything. But I learned that, hey, I asked the person, hey, what's your superpower? What is the thing in your business that you are focused on, or that that you're like most passionate about? I want to know what that is. Okay. And I tell them, hey, that allows me to promote you as the expert that you are. Right. I mean, it allows us to have a great conversation about what you're great at and helps me to promote you well. And so I let them talk about that thing, because even in our business, I don't do everything in our business, and our investors wouldn't want me to do everything in our business. Right. That wouldn't be wise. But I don't want to get that person on that say focused on they're the marketing director of the real estate syndication firm, and I start asking them about how to underwrite, a multifamily deal, if the numbers work. Well, that's not in their wheelhouse whatsoever, and you're going to have a horrible show, right? And so
mm,
I ask them that up front, and that has helped me a ton. It starts, it creates a little conversation right then. They already feel more comfortable because they're talking about something they love or they care about so
right.
much, right? And I start taking notes immediately, right? About what I think we're going to talk about, or some things I know I want to bring up. But that's been very helpful, just ask those questions in the very beginning, and just to calm their nerves a little bit also.
Such good stuff. And really what you're saying is doesn't just apply, Whitney, to a podcast show. I mean, that goes a long way in having conversations, just talking with people and getting to know that individual, listening. I think is something that we could all learn, certainly. So, Whitney, thank you so much, man. This has been great. I love getting to hear these stories and hear more about what you have learned and how you are continuing to develop this skill and really, I think, encouraging and challenging what you have done and what you have accomplished. Is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners today?
Yeah, no, I appreciate you, Brian. I'm grateful just for the connection, and even now, I want people to know about who you are as well, and Vox Valens was a thing that we talked about the the process of doing podcasts, right? And the production and all that stuff. Well, I brought that in-house. We built a team, all those things. And Brian now leads that team, and he has his own marketing business, and he is much more qualified to lead that team of producing podcasts than I ever thought about being. But Brian really wanted them to know, hey, where can they learn more about Vox Valens, and even pick designs as well, and maybe some things that you offer outside of podcasting services also.
Yeah, thanks, Whitney. I really wanted to focus on you today, but I do think it is important if you are thinking about starting a podcast. We do have editing services through voxvalensmedia.com. And there is an opportunity to fill out a form. If you're interested in just you be the voice behind it, hit record, send us the raw files. We'll help get you launched. We'll help get you those files and video, audio edited, and even help with marketing and social media and those type of things to get to where you can just come into the studio, come into your office, wherever it is, hit record, and let us take care of the rest. So it's been a great opportunity to be able to work with Whitney on these shows, and a few other guests or a few other clients that we've got rolling now. So yeah, we also have pickdesigns.co.com. On there, we'll do a lot of videography, logos, graphic design, and we'll do a lot of in-house publications and things of that nature. So would love to chat with you if you have any more questions. Also, if you'd like to be a guest on the Real Estate Syndication Show, we'll have the links in the show notes as well. And would love to have that you be a part of Whitney's show.
Thank you for being with us again today. I hope that you have learned a lot from the show. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I hope you're telling your friends about the Real Estate Syndication Show and how they can also build wealth in real estate. You can also go to lifebridgecapital.com and start investing today.